Amy Dinn with Lone Star Legal Aid. I'm the managing attorney for the environmental justice team, and I really appreciate the opportunity today to talk to y'all because our program is relatively new. We basically got started about 4 months, maybe before Harvey started, and that really kind of threw a wrench in our strategic plan, but I think in some ways it helped highlight some of the issues that our communities that we are really working to serve or facing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the tools that we've tried to put in our toolbox to outreach to some of these communities that I really feel are like some of the most vulnerable that we have in Houston. So I want to appreciate the opportunity to talk today, and Lone Star Legal Aid's been around for a very long time. We're actually on some of the front lines at many of the disaster recovery centers and helping people recover from Harvey, getting their FEMA claims and things, but our new project, which is our environmental justice group, is really focused on long-term systemic change. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of those challenges today. So where this all starts really is with discrimination that is historic in this town and other parts of the country, as well as most of Texas. There were areas that basically were redlined from a very early stage in the city, and that is where industrial use kind of proliferated adjacent to where people lived. And so that's the context and the legacy that these communities are now facing, where we have communities that are juxtaposed with industrial pollution and environmental hazards, and they are kind of left without options in an area where we don't have zoning to protect them. So this is the Manchester community, and I think y'all may have heard during Elena Craft's presentation earlier, I think the number was 1,888 pounds of benzene was released from the facility right next to this house. And these are the challenges that people are facing in light of Hurricane Harvey, or just on a daily basis in our city. And these communities have not had the support or opportunity to face these challenges appropriately, and that's one of the things that our team is working on trying to address. So we have these environmental pollutions that people are facing daily, and I think we all saw firsthand as Harvey can exacerbate these problems in our community. All of a sudden, the industrial pollutants and everything contaminate the floodwaters, and they're prevalent for everyone. I think one of the things to remember is that some people are living with these industrial pollutants on a daily basis because they are part of their community, and then when you have a storm like Harvey, things just get even worse for them, particularly in areas that are already low income where they don't have the resources to be resilient in dealing with these problems. So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory agencies and people that are there to help support those communities that, as we know as a community, aren't always doing the best job to help them. We've got the EPA and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They're going to set the national regulatory scheme for enforcement on claims. And then we also can look to the city of Houston as well as Harris County for local government regulations. And I'll touch a little bit about some of the regulations that they try to take. Our group is focused on the neighborhoods, the civic clubs and the community organizations that are background in these communities, and trying to outreach to them to let them know how they can get involved and be more active in taking control of fighting back against these environmental hazards. So we'll look a little bit about these neighborhood-based efforts that we're really focused on engaging with communities in these areas. All right, so you have permitting challenges. I think probably most people know that you can protest a permit for an expansion of a facility when it revolves around air regulation, land regulation, or water. And these are some of the areas where we're trying to help educate communities by going out and doing environmental education on how they can basically get involved in the permitting process. One of the challenges that they face is that they're very short notice periods for a lot of these permits, and it's challenging to get into a community that isn't already active and engaged around that, get them the information and tools so they can submit written comments and be effectively part of that process. That's one of the things that we're trying to do by establishing our environmental justice newsletter as well as our community action alerts to get a group of people in a certain neighborhood so that when we know that their zip code's impacted by a new facility or an expansion permit, that we can let them know and they can get engaged. We are absolutely available to come out and do outreach in these neighborhoods to help people with these issues. The other thing we've tried to do is fight nuisance actions. So some of these facilities are right back on the border with immediate neighborhoods. I think some of the high profile things, South Ashby High Rise obviously happened in a much higher income neighborhood, but you also have the White Oak Music Hall, which was a nuisance case that made a lot of news because of the noise pollution that was being generated by that new facility, and children that were trying to sleep at night before task testing and stuff like that had clear problems. We've had a recent case, I think Rodrigo Cantu, one of our staff attorneys here, was working on one with a concrete batch plant where it basically abutted a residential neighborhood, so they basically shared a border. And we were trying to fight the noise and dust pollution that was generated by that facility. These types of cases are very hard to prove on the plaintiff side, unfortunately. Texas Supreme Court has created a burden for plaintiffs to basically put on evidence, and in fact, sometimes if it's an existing facility, unless there's a change in conditions, it's very hard to stop the ongoing nuisances with those facilities and develop your case. So this leads us to some of the focus of our efforts at Lone Star is that we believe that with no zoning, we need to create our own zoning. And the way we can do that for some of these communities is by putting deed restrictions in place. A lot of y'all probably already live in deed restriction communities that maybe have a restriction for land use, like that's residential use only. Many of these communities absolutely lack those protections. Or they have existing regulations that either haven't been enforced or have expired over time. So what we've been trying to do is educate communities that this is a basis for them to protect their community, where they can develop what that restrictions would look like, and we'll be able to help them put them in place. So this is a new initiative that Lone Star Legal Aid is launching. I'm trying to maybe use it as a platform today to let you know that this is a service that we're going to be offering to communities to help them reinforce these efforts. We find that this may be the only way in Houston that we can basically reinforce these communities so that they don't have to have concrete batch plants installed right across the street from them. There's some challenges to creating new deed restrictions where there weren't any. Luckily, the legislature has, because of the history of discrimination that existed in a lot of deed restrictions, provided a platform or opportunities through legislation that went in the early 2000s to basically update and revise deed restrictions to take out covenants that were racially discriminatory. So there's opportunities now through those changes in legislature to create new restrictions where they didn't exist, or update them to remove provisions that are against public policy. So who can enforce them? And this is a really important thing for low-income communities because they don't always have the resources to go fight big Ashby high-rise that may be coming into their neighborhood. So we're really going to have, we can't always rely on the property owners to fight the other commercial property owners. It's just not a fair battle with the resources on the other side. So sometimes we can use civic clubs, but even then, they do not necessarily have the same resources that a civic club in Westview or something has to fight these fights. So we are really going to have to rely on both the City of Houston and Harris County to help us enforce deed restrictions that are properly enacted for these neighborhoods. Houston, the City of Houston has limited enforcement on deed restrictions. They basically will do any kind of restrictions that affect land use. And so a lot of the things that we're going to be focused on and doing these deed restriction improvements are really just focusing on residential use only. And the county also will enforce deed restrictions for the same reasons, but they have limited enforcement. Again, we're not trying to mandate what color people's houses are painted. We're basically trying to restrict property in a certain zone that would only be for residential use to keep the encroachment of commercial uses out. So the city also does regulate some things that I'm getting a little bit of time, but they will basically do some regulations basically on a health and safety method. And these are a whole list of the different regulations that regulates. Unfortunately, a lot of these things are not often enforced. And so one of the things that we can do to help these communities is encourage our 311 calls and things like that in these communities to help keep these restrictions off the book. These are some of the public nuisances that City of Houston will enforce. And I've got some code references here. And then the noise and sound regulation within the City of Houston. Unfortunately, a lot of these facilities all propagate outside of the city limits, and we find that this is not helpful to enforce that. I think Commissioner Ellis mentioned that this morning. Another thing just to recognize, and this is great for people that like trees, any residential use that's abutting commercial use needs to have a landscape or tree barrier put into it according to city code. I don't think that happens very often, but it's another opportunity to advocate if you see new commercial development going in next to residential areas, that landscape buffer should be in place. And the county does some regulations as well. They're more limited in the jurisdiction, as Rodney Ellis mentioned this morning, but they do have some environmental regulation enforcement. And I think the county is one of the best people that are out there fighting environmental regulation right now on behalf of our community, but we still have a lot of work to do.